I give it all to you.
Hey, what's up, everyone? My name is Walt. I'm a pastor at Hope Church NYC. Thanks so much for listening to our podcast, No Bad Questions. I'm joined here with my friends and colleagues, Jacqueline Childress, our Next Gen Director, and Pastor Jordan Varghese, our teaching pastor down at Hope East Village. I'm so glad that we finally, after a long-awaited time, are kicking off our very first podcast in our series called No Bad Questions. And I think the vision behind this series is to begin a conversation with members of our community around some of the questions that feel the most difficult to ask. I've been in the ministry game for, coming up on like 2 decades now. And I feel like whenever a conversation begins by somebody saying like, okay, I don't know if I can ask this question, or I'm afraid to ask this question because I don't want you to get offended. Then I'm like, sweet, like this is going to be a really good question because it's going to be a question that's really personal to them, where there's real stakes about life and faith and Jesus and community and relationships and all these really important things. And so I feel like for me, there's no bad questions. I feel like we want to be a community that welcomes all kind of questions, even the ones that feel like they're touching on kind of the hardest, most taboo subjects. I think if we're really going to be a community that is trying to pursue a life of faith together, then we really have to be comfortable engaging with maybe at times uncomfortable conversations. So we threw kind of the feelers out to our community, and we said, hey, what are the questions that you really would like to talk about? What feels important and significant to you? And we got back some really great responses. And a couple of them were really interesting in that they had to do with questions around death and the end times, right? What happens when Jesus comes again? What's going to go on, right, in those pages of Revelation, or when Jesus is talking about the future? And so we thought, sure, what fitting place to begin our podcast than by talking about the end. And so we're going to look at 3 different questions from members of our community and just have some conversation around it. Hopefully it'll be fun and easygoing, not too contentious, no throwing, phones at people or anything like that. But yeah, again, just to create space to have questions that maybe, I don't expect necessarily that we'd be like answering these fully. Even a lot of this topic in and of itself is kind of speculative, and there's a whole width and breadth within the Christian tradition that answers these questions in different ways. But my hope is that we can have just some fun conversation. People can pick it up from there. So we got a great question that I think sets the tone for things from one of our members at Hope Westside. And they wrote, "Sometimes when I read the Bible, I get afraid of all the things to come. Is it normal to feel such feelings?" Love that question. Jacqueline, love to kick it over for you and hear how you start to engage with that.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, I came to faith pretty young, I would say. I was in kind of early elementary school, and I think at that time, your brain doesn't really have the ability to comprehend kind of the scarier, darker things. And so I feel for me, I more so glossed over those harder questions. I mean, at 7 years old, I don't think you could really comprehend, life and death and those sorts of things. And then when I got to college and kind of really started deepening my faith, I realized, wow, I have a lot of questions about what's going on, and even still to this day. But in college, once I was starting to realize kind of what was going on, I felt a lot of pressure that those questions made me like a bad Christian, or I wasn't allowed to have these questions. And because I had been a believer for so long at that point, I felt really kind of behind in my faith, because I thought, if I'm having these questions now, what has that meant for the last 10 years? And so I remember I had a friend that shared with me, your faith is so individual and personal to you. And so if you're kind of glossing over some things because you're like, well, this is what I've believed for so long, it's okay to ask those questions and figure it out for yourself, because you need to, have your own faith journey and answer those questions yourself. So that was just really big for me to kind of start diving in and realizing that it's not a bad question, or it's not normal to have those feelings, because you have to have your own kind of faith discovery in that time. Yeah.
For sure. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. I mean, Jordan, you're a pastor down at East Village. You probably hear some of these questions come up, right? Especially, I feel like the emotional weight around thinking about what's to come and how to hold all these questions of the afterlife and human destiny. And tell me kind of what begins to get stirred up for you.
Yeah, I think what strikes me with this question is the idea of like, is it normal to feel these feelings? And I'm like, yeah, I think it is, because when we're thinking of what the scriptures are doing to us, like we're asking the same questions that we are when like we think about what a normal piece of poetry does, or a piece of film, or a piece of media, right? Like they are trying to strike at certain emotional chords or feelings of like what it means to be human. So yes, it is normal to feel those feelings, I think. Like you read Revelation, you hear about like these huge beasts coming out of the sea. It's like, yeah, Cloverfield was a scary movie, right? It's the same thing. These scriptures, I think, and the authors who wrote them are trying to evoke these feelings. And that's kind of the point. And then we wrestle with what does it mean for us to feel these feelings? And when we have these fears of the ways these things are being described, like what is our hope now? What is the thing we're hoping for? It's like, why is the author trying to get us to feel these feelings with these types of images, these types of like ideas? Yeah.
Yeah. And how would you even begin to kind of answer that question? Like, why do you think the author is kind of trying to prompt those feelings and reflections?
Yeah, I think ultimately, like, especially with, like, let's look at the book of Revelation, all these images of, like, the beast and the harlot, right? Or the, like, Babylon falling. They are trying to evoke a feeling of fear and anxiety. But what I don't think is happening, I don't think it's like a scare straight of like, you know what I mean? like let's show you all these horrible things that'll happen to you one day and get you to kind of believe the right thing. I think it is trying to paint a contrast between a type of life where one's hope is in kind of things in the world, whether it be money, whether it be like social status, whether it be prestige, versus a hope that's in something else. And I think particularly in the scriptures, Old and New Testament, they are pointing to a messianic hope, right? Like a hope in someone who will come and make the world right, the person of Jesus. And I think when you look at like Revelation, it's these two hopes. One hope that leads to despair and pain and suffering, and one hope that leads to a life that is full of hope and full of joy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I remember hearing from a good friend of mine, you know, when he talks about the warnings that are in the scriptures, you know, whether it be Jesus, you know, offering a lot of stern warnings kind of in the Gospels or even kind of in Paul's letters or epistles or Revelation, it is this like you warn somebody because you don't want, you know, these things to befall them, right? And it's a way of Jesus teaching us around kind of, hey, look at the kind of ways our decisions can lead to just destructive patterns, right? And it kind of can further alienate us from one another, can create, you know, in our experience, like a distance between us and God. And like, you don't want that. Like, that's not going to be good for you. That's not going to lead to like life and fullness for you. I think where it can get tricky and where I've seen it kind of produce fear or anxiety or concern, maybe in like unhealthy ways, is kind of how I think Christian communities can sometimes be like a little weird about their handling of all this stuff, or even kind of manipulative around this. Like I was talking to one friend, and she said that in her youth group, their youth group director, and I know you would never do this, Jacqueline, so I'm grateful for that. But he was talking to them about like evangelism and the importance of sharing your faith with, you know, your friends who aren't followers of Jesus. Like great, like important topic. But he painted this picture where he said it's like when you die, you're going to be taking this elevator up to heaven, and you're going to go past hell, and you're going to see all your friends saying, "Why didn't you tell me?" And they're going to be all sad, and you're going to feel terrible. But then like up you go to paradise, and they're like suffering forever. And you're like, wow, that's pretty rough, right?
Yeah.
In terms of how these kind of images are used to kind of paint pictures of who God is and what our responsibility in the world is. And I think for me, so much of it comes back to this character of God, you know, is even kind of an eternal destiny away from God, something where God is, you know, kind of throwing people in some kind of like fiery prison, locking it up, and be like, you had your chance, I told you, right? Or is it more of this, the constant pattern we see in scriptures of God kind of let people get what they want. And that if people want life away from God, then God was like, well, you know, to quote Paul, like give them over to this life that they desire. But we know from the scriptures that God wants everyone to come to know life in Jesus, to turn from our sin and our selfishness and experience reconciliation and hope, and that God will do a lot to accomplish that, and that God cares about our friends more than we do. That God loves every single person on this planet far more than we ever could. And so I feel like when I hear questions like this, I can't help but think like, oh, like there's some ideas in here that are stoking fears unnecessarily, because they're painting a picture of God that I would say is not biblical. It's not true to, I think, how the scriptures hold these complicated passages. And I'm curious, like for you guys, like, did you ever kind of get little like analogies or images like this, or have you found kind of in your conversation with either like youth or members of your community kind of the need to undo some of this stuff?
Yeah, I think I would say that I've had people in my life who maybe grew up with a different upbringing and had a lot of that to unpack as they got older, or it maybe turned them away from the faith, thinking that if a God could do these types of things, what does that mean for their future? But I had a friend once share with me that life here on earth is, for people who believe in Jesus and have Jesus in their heart, earth is the closest you'll get to hell, and like what that looks like for your future. And I remember just being comforted by that in kind of my journey of, it's not kind of, or, what life looks like. This is the closest, you can get to that. And then on the other side, you're in heaven. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think you're kind of exactly right with that, Jacqueline, too, because like when you read the scriptures, think about Genesis, like the opposite of heaven isn't hell. Like it's rarely put as heaven and hell. It's always heaven and earth. Like that's the creation narrative. That's even the Revelation 21 narrative, right? Of heaven and earth coming together. So yeah, I think the popular conception of like afterlife stuff is always we're on earth and then there are two doors. One door leads to heaven, one door leads to hell. The worst game show ever imaginable, right? But that's like rarely, like that's not the narrative of scripture we see throughout the whole arc. Like it's really the story of like the incarnation of heaven coming to earth and making earth right. And one day those two places becoming one. So I think that is like an accurate kind of way of looking at things. Yeah.
And especially, I appreciate how you're like, actually like hell is a lot of kind of what is experienced on earth, right? And I think often this concept of judgment, which is really a big component of at least kind of what kind of kicks off this kind of eternal destiny for humanity, God coming in Jesus to judge creation, that can stir a lot of fear. And I know for me growing up, it was a lot of this like, I hope I'm doing enough, like I hope I'm good enough, and I didn't fully appreciate the grace and love of Jesus, and that could give me an assurance that God is with me, that God is going to make a way for me to be reconciled back and forgiven. And yet I think for many of us, we don't really like that idea, right, of God coming to judge evil and sin. And yet, like, when we look at the news and we look at what's going on kind of in the world, there, for so much of the early church, for even in the scriptures, right, it is a sense of like, come quickly, Lord Jesus. Like there's so much suffering, there's so much pain, there's so much death. Recently I was listening to another Bible commentator saying the 20th century was the bloodiest century in all of history. And like, we've made a mess of God's creation. And we continue in these patterns of violence and enslavement and exploitation. And like, we should want somebody to come and clean all of this up. And yet, of course, the paradox is like, well, we're complicit in that. But because of God's goodness, God makes a way for us to be forgiven, for evil to be truly reckoned with and addressed, and yet for us to be brought back into relationship with God, to relationship with one another. And a friend of mine said, like, yeah, actually, I think a lot of these kind of early stages of life together, in heaven, we'll be doing this work of reconciliation. Like, we're gonna have plenty of time to kind of talk with those whom we've wronged, to work out all the different ways that we've just mishandled our relationships, or we've perpetrated injustice, and that there's going to be this great kind of healing and resurrection life that we do get to experience. It's not going to be like a snap of the fingers and we forgot about everything's great now and what just happened, that was weird, what a weird fever dream. But we'll be able to find healing and wholeness together. But the judgment is ultimately that's actually like pretty good news for us and how we think about our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately with this question of like the fear, I just think that the fact that like when Paul describes the life with God, he says that perfect love like drives that fear. Actually, sorry, that's not Paul, that's John. Throwing that. Yeah, I think about John and the fact that he writes that perfect love casts out fear. Like this idea that Christian people who put their hope in Jesus and what he's done for us and the power of his resurrection, like we actually don't have to be afraid. Like we have a security. And like, again, I think we get in trouble when we like think of the Bible as a like answer book where we're like kind of going to the glossary, looking at like afterlife and then going to every passage and being like, what are the answers to this? Because throughout the scriptures, we see different images of like the afterlife or what final judgment looks like or what end times. And they sometimes are similar, sometimes they're different. And like, how do we reconcile them? At the end of the day, like they kind of paint a broad picture of what life with God will be like and what life without God will look like. But for those of us that put hope in Jesus and his life, death, and resurrection, like we are promised a restored life, like a full restoration. I was at this concert a few years ago where one of the members of the choir had recently passed from cancer, and they had dedicated a song to her. But one of the choir members came up and was offering kind of a word of encouragement. One of the things they said that always stuck with me was like, our dear friend wasn't healed on this side, but we know because of the power of Jesus, they're healed on the next. And like, it's that image of hope and joy and like final healing and restoration that we get to long for and wait for. So like death isn't a like scary, thing that we have to be worried about. And the end times isn't that for us either. There's a deep hope and promise we get to wait and long for.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I think like these questions, right, and these curiosities around the end times, right, around what's to come, I'm like, I think all of those questions are like so important. Like it's such fair game, right? I think it's just there, and there's so much rich thought and literature throughout the Christian tradition that kind of answers this in different ways or kind of helps fill out different like pieces of the puzzle. And yet I think of, for me, it kind of comes back to Abraham's words in Genesis 18, where he says, "Will not the judge of the earth do right?" I'm like, I'm just gonna trust, that however this all goes, like it's gonna be good, and Jesus will work it out because of who he is, and of who we get to be, because of that. So I'm like, I'm just hope that when I'm there, I'm like, I'm just gonna be like cheering it on and be like, God, do whatever it is you want to do because it's gonna be good because you're good, and so great, come Lord Jesus, like heal our world and put things to right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think something that's just so important about just this podcast and asking questions is I saw a quote that said, you are young as long as you are curious and wanting to have questions answered and wanting to dig deeper into things. And the minute you stop being curious is kind of the minute you start aging, quote unquote, is what the quote was saying. And so I just always find questions. And, for me, if I ever find myself asking, is this normal? What is it? Yes, it normally is, because it means you're encouraged and curious about kind of digging deeper into your faith and into different things.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Good stuff. Good. Well, let's check out the second question then. This is from a member of our Midtown community, and they wrote, "After you die, is there a holding space before you go to heaven while we wait for Jesus to come?" It's a good one. Jordan, what's your take?
I don't know. So I think Tim Mackey has a really helpful way of thinking of this. I think he gets it from N.T. Wright out of his writing. There's like life, there's life after death, and then there's life after death. These kind of three stages of thinking. And the overall like structure, see, we know what life is. There's good things like burritos, there's bad things like disease, right? Like, so we kind of get a sense of that. The promise of like life after death, like if you look at the story of Jesus on the cross with the thief, of like, today you will be with me in paradise. So like there is some kind of consolation that we have of like when we die and have life after death, like we're with Jesus in some way. Now, disclaimer, I have never died. So I don't know what that looks like, but there is some hope that we can hold on to, that like the people that we love, that that followed Jesus, that had their faith in his promise, like they're with him in some way, and there's like a consolation there. And then this like life after death is this image of like, Revelation 19 to 21, right? Of like this like fully restored earth, where there's no more tears, there's no more disease, there's no more hunger, like things are fully made right. And it's like this final kind of culmination of all of God's love and power being shown in the world.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Because I know for me, like, so I grew up, I think as I mentioned, I grew up Catholic. And so within the Catholic Church, there's a doctrine, I don't know if it's prominent now, maybe as it was when I was growing up or even prior, the doctrine of purgatory. And I don't know if this is kind of where this person's coming from or not in their question. But basically it was this idea that like, okay, like when you die, you're going to go to this place, purgatory. It's going to be kind of like this waiting room. But like you're going to be paying still for what you've done wrong. And then even kind of enduring some kind of like physical torment or pain as a way of achieving some kind of satisfaction for the things that we've done wrong. And so for a while, growing up, I was like, okay, I guess that's just something to look forward to. And, it wasn't until later I began to kind of understand more about that. It has a strange history of really being joined around kind of indulgences, which are, these kind of like financial, kind of problematic practices of the Catholic Church to kind of drive finances for the sake of like, oh, well, you'll get some like time shaved off your sentence.
Yeah.
We're not going to find that anywhere in the scriptures. And so if somebody were to ask me this question and what was behind that for them, is like, okay, am I going to be in some kind of like tough spot where I have to somehow work towards saying I'm sorry, even experience some like physical torment as a consequence for that? I would say you'd be pretty hard pressed to find like real grounding for that in scriptures. And I think even Jordan, like as we were talking about it, you're like, if it doesn't like smell like the gospel, like there should be like a little bit of a smell test. Like, it doesn't sound like that's what Jesus would sign you up for. But there is some like really interesting stuff in the scriptures where we get some ideas around these intermediate spaces. I think it can be easy to be like, okay, I'm going to die, snap my fingers, and all of a sudden, like, I'll be like fast forwarded, like maybe I'll fall asleep and then I'll wake up and everything will be going down. I'm like, oh, great. And hey, maybe that is going to happen, right? There is, Paul does use language of people falling asleep and, kind of being awoken with this big trumpet blast, and maybe that'll be some of it. But then there are these interesting kind of notes like in the scriptures of, as Jordan mentioned, this concept of paradise as being an intermediate place for those who love and trust Jesus, as kind of like a waiting for Jesus to come again and make all things new. And there's a theologian, Donald Blesh, described it this way. He said that paradise has perfect love and holiness, but not yet perfect peace and joy, because the people, the saints who are in this place of paradise, are still contending for against injustice and suffering on earth. So there's still this kind of like role in prayer and desiring for God to come and make things new, just to the point that we were talking about, like judging the world justly. And so like there's still some kind of like skin in the game of saying like, yeah, we like the world has not yet been put to right, and we're going to continue to cry out against injustice until it is. As like, yeah, maybe that could happen. And then on the flip side, kind of a place of like desolation, Sheol or Hades. You hear references in Psalms and in Revelation to that as a place for those whose trust is not in Jesus, where they will be. And it's typically described with like a lot of this kind of imagery of like darkness and such. But then like you also get texts like in Peter where he talks about Jesus going to like preach the gospel to those who are in Hades, and you kind of wonder like, oh wow, like maybe there's still kind of an opportunity there for those to turn and to be won over to the goodness of the gospel. Who knows? Maybe like it's not, again, it's speculative.
Yeah.
But it is interesting to think about. But again, I just feel like we have to keep grounding it in the character of God. But like we were joking about how like pop culture has like some very like, I don't know, strong curiosities and engagement around this. And what did you see?
And I think I think this question is really important just because it seems to be a big question that just our wider culture has. Yeah. It feels like in most TV shows, movies, books, there's kind of some element of what this looks like in the afterlife. Is there, in horror movies, it's the ghosts can't get out of purgatory and they have to, what side and things like that. And I just think even not in things like that, but also like The Good Place was one of the number one shows, which was all about kind of being in this space and what the doors mean. And I just think it's a curiosity that a lot of people are wondering, and it ends up in a lot of our culture messaging. And so I think kind of what you both were saying, kind of rooting it in scripture and kind of going back to the character, of God and what that looks like. Because it can be so easy to turn to whatever's on the TV or in the book or in this to kind of start stirring those questions. But just that importance on the scripture aspect of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like the question that popular culture is always asking of hell is how many layers does it have, right? Like it's like a 7-layer dip, yep. Right?
Yeah.
Right? But it's just
the hell dip.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's at one of your burrito restaurants.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I think again, like even when we think of like hell as this like intermediate space, like again, when we read hell, like we are kind of inundated by our cultural like understandings of it, right? Like it's very hot, but except the last layer, it's very cold. Like, but all of that comes from where? Like Dante's Inferno, like Drag Me to Hell, like these random horror movies. But when we talk in the scriptures, like Jesus, when he uses the word hell, it's Gehenna, right? And Gehenna is this place that is like a literal physical place near Jerusalem. So there's a couple of like obviously different takes on what this is, but ultimately it's clearly a metaphor, right? Like it's both a like, yes, spiritual destination, but it's a physical place that Jesus is referring to that's like a metaphor for destruction, for a metaphor for like a life that leads to not life anymore, right? Something that is really horrible for you. And like, I think we know that, right? The ways of living, of whether it's greed, like doesn't end well. It's not good for us and it's not good for the people around for us. So yeah, I think it's like understanding that metaphor that Jesus is kind of pointing us to.
Yeah. And the reason that term was used, Gehenna, right, the Valley of Hinnom, was because it was like an actual place where like kings made human sacrifices, including child sacrifice, right? And so it was associated, like it was just like the worst of the worst was happening there, right? And so the scriptures are like, this God is going to judge that, right? Because that is awful, right? And again, it should kind of stir the sense in us, like, yeah, like God doesn't need to come and make things right. And so kind of linking this image of a world that's like, you're not going to get much more broken, right, than child sacrifice, and say, God, you have to come and intervene, right? We should kind of yearn for that, and then also yearn for God to kind of forgive us, right, and our own complicity in all these different things. So it is this like both and that happens there. I think you were about to say something.
Yes, I was, and it has left my brain.
It was like, I was curious, like even that does happen.
Yes.
I mean, as you were kind of riffing on, some of these shows and ghost stories and things like that. Like, I'm curious, like, what do you think is kind of even behind that? Like, why is our culture, like the preoccupation, with this? And obviously, it can get kind of like a little horror, kind of like the Dante imagery, like very vivid, very interesting. But I'm curious, like what you're seeing as somebody who does go to the horror movies, more often than me, because I'm a scaredy cat. What are you seeing people kind of trying to get at in those productions?
I think it's interesting that I think in our culture, there are just, I feel like our culture can be kind of split on the religious side of things, but I do think that everyone has this understanding of, I guess, religious imagery being really powerful and important. So even maybe if people aren't religious or aren't Christian, they understand kind of the depth of the imagery. And so a lot of people still tend to use a lot of religious imagery, whether they believe or not, because of, I think there is some knowing of importance of it. And I think a lot of people are just searching for answers, either to justify kind of their beliefs or their thoughts. And so I think our culture kind of obsesses over putting out answers and putting out things that everyone can kind of either relate to or whether it's justifying their thoughts. And so I do find it interesting. Like, you even see it in music a lot. People will use a lot of religious imagery in music, but then claim to not be believers. But they know that the religious imagery is so powerful, so deep, can convey such either beautiful or tragic, emotions. And so I always find it really interesting. And I actually try to dig like deeper into those people who either write the movies or write the music, because they just, you have some concept of this being a more powerful emotion than how you could have described something using religious imagery. And it will provoke a deeper feeling from your audience. And so kind of how do you balance either, not believing that these things are real, but kind of using it for, your show, movie, or music. And so I find it really fascinating, but I think everyone is just looking for answers or looking for ways to kind of confirm or deny certain beliefs in life. Yeah.
All right. The final question. This is like a really personal one. I really appreciated this from one of our Midtown members. What does the Bible say about suicide? And do they, I'm assuming meaning those who commit suicide, go to heaven, and are they forgiven? Jordan, as a pastor, how would you answer this?
Yeah. I think we have to like obviously take this with a degree of like sobriety, just because like there are people like that are close to me that I know have either had their own like struggles with suicide ideation or have had someone close who's been affected by this. So I think like anytime we answer like a theological question, like we need to kind of approach it, I think in the way that Jesus did, which is like we're talking about people, and like people are made in the image of God, and they are loved, and they are delighted in, right? I think for me, like suicide is often something that feels like the only answer for people, and it's like a result of brokenness on all kinds of levels. What I see Jesus tell us is in his own teaching, he says like there is only one unforgivable sin, and he doesn't say it's murder or suicide or anything like that. He doesn't name a bunch of other mortal sins. He says there's one, and it's blaspheming the Holy Spirit. This idea of like just not trusting in Jesus, of not trusting the prompting of the Holy Spirit to put your full-fledged faith in Jesus. So I think like, yeah, I want to tread lightly to ever say like, oh yeah, that one's the you're it's the black card, like you're done if you do this. I don't think it is, because again, it doesn't smell like the gospel, right? Like where if someone's struggling with severe mental illness or a lot of pain and suffering, like I don't think that would be Jesus's heart toward them.
Yeah. That's really helpful. I totally agree. And I think, again, this is my Catholic upbringing, kind of resurfacing, and perhaps in other traditions as well. There have been teachings that kind of play into this kind of dynamic. You're like saying like that there are these kind of mortal sins that are kind of unforgivable, and suicide being one of them. But again, like to your point, we're like, well, that's not like what the scriptures say. And I feel like I would just really push back on, anything that would kind of set up a system where God's like, oh wow, I really want to like love and save this person, and like you're good, but like, oh well, I can't do anything for you now, right? And I just think, whoa, that's actually really tips the scales, I think, away from God's power and insistence and desire to save, from just, I don't know, like the limits of what we do, right? And to kind of have our own kind of eternal destiny kind of boil down to like a moment of profound like sadness and darkness and pain, and to think that somehow God wouldn't be present with us, in those moments. I think of what David said in Psalm 139. He said, if I go up to heaven, you are there. If I go down to the grave or Sheol, you are there. And it's like, yeah, even in our like moments of most profound darkness and loss and suffering, and even when we feel like there's no other way out, God is there, being God for us, God with us in those moments. And so, yeah, I just want to speak kind of like comfort. I know sometimes it's kind of gotten weird with, family members, right, who have had to grieve this, which is just incredibly heart-wrenching and so painful, and yet have felt like, well, now there's this kind of like weird kind of theological layer around it where it casts kind of uncertainty over, where this person stands in relation to God. And it's like, yeah, even in these moments, like this person might have kind of not known kind of what their options are or where they stood. But God was never changing towards them. And God knew exactly who God was going to be for them and exactly how much God cared for them. And that God was going to do everything that God had in God's power to save them and to bring them back. And so I would really wanting to reframe, I think, how we might answer that question theologically. Yeah. And I know, Jacqueline, you've had, we were just processing a little bit, and you were sharing about just your experience with classmates and, just in a really difficult year, and kind of what you learned about being with people, kind of like how God is with people. And love to hear.
Yeah, definitely.
Share about
this was just, I feel like in a lot of different contexts, sometimes Christians can immediately jump to trying to fix or answer or solve. And sometimes it's not necessarily what people need in that moment. I unfortunately encountered just a lot of suicide my senior year, a lot of people in my class, and then encountered it just much more closely when I went to college my freshman year. And for me, it was kind of stepping in my freshman year of college. I was really growing in my faith. My faith seemed to be really exploding. And there were just people in my life who were really, really suffering. And so who weren't Christians. And so what does it look like to, come alongside Christian or your non-Christian friends or people who don't have the same worldview? Because it's one of those moments where you can't expect people to respond the way you do with, just a different view of the world. And so for me, it was a lot of processing how to be there for the people in my life the best that I could. And so for a lot of those times, it was really just sitting in silence with people, not offering any advice, any thought, just really, it was a lot of silence and a lot of just listening. And a lot of people want just a consistent presence. And so I learned very quickly it was a lot of not trying to fix or slap a prayer Band-Aid or, try and do those things, but just sitting in silence with people and being next to people kind of through those moments ended up being just the most beneficial. And yeah, I just think that's kind of a lens to have kind of when helping people or just like going through these times with people. It's just a lot of just trying to listen and kind of see where people are coming from in that.
Yeah, I think there's something profoundly biblical about that whole practice of like, we're just going to sit and be with people when they're at their lowest moments, right? And the need, right, of community to engage in like a truly helpful way, which sometimes like doing like the bare bit, like
right.
Absolutely, like just keep your mouth shut, right? Just be there. Don't try to kind of put any, like you said, like Band-Aids on, like just like these spiritual platitudes or things like that, but just to like sit and be present and grieve alongside members of our community who are also grieving, like truly a loss.
Yeah, and I think just another thing, just for me, was I think sometimes in these moments you have a lot of thoughts of, I don't have the right thing to say, or I don't know what to do, or I don't know how to be there for this person. And I know for me, I've had to just step back and think, it's not about you. Like, it's not about me and what I can provide for this person at all, really. It's just about them and about the person and about, just showing up. But I think sometimes we overthink kind of what to do when it's really just kind of as simple as, showing up. Yeah.
Thanks for showing up. Yeah. Appreciate the many ways that I've seen you guys just walk alongside people who are in difficult moments. And I would just say that if you are listening and finding yourself in, a dark place, to know that you're not alone, that there are people in our community who care for you, that we have pastors and ministers and so many folks who just are willing to sit with you in these dark moments. So our community is here to be a support. There's a suicide hotline, 988, that you can call anytime to receive counseling and help. And we're with one another. I think that's why we come together as a community, because it's way better than going alone. So glad to be in it with you guys. Well, I think this is kind of like we kind of got the ball rolling, I think, a little bit on a couple of these really great questions. There'll hopefully be more to come. I know we got a couple questions in the hopper related to sex and relationships and recreational drug use and scriptures and all kinds of good things.
Easy topics.
Yeah, easy. The
Yes.
softballs. So to those listening, if you have questions, we'd love to hear them. Go ahead and submit them on our website or in the show notes. And hopefully some more hard but honest and real questions to come. So thanks for being here, guys.
Thank you, Walt.
Thank you.
See you next time.